uh, if there's some kind of sensitive transaction that you need to engage lawyers for, or some sort of firm that would be providing hints as to what's going on, whether that's acquisitions or mergers or anything such, that's going to be quite vital. But yeah, I think that's the news, and the technology was built on it, so it's great to see it finally come out.
Cool. Well, now that I know you work there, plus I hear all of that, I'm just I'm going all in on STRK. So that's good. Who needs Bitcoin
Four
now?
cents. It's never been cheaper. Well,
Let's see.
except for like a week ago, maybe. But yeah.
I think
Um,
I'll meet some of the Stocknet people at ECC, by the way. So curious
oh,
to
nice.
to go to that event. Hey, Satiris.
Hey guys.
Hey, Stuart. How's it going?
Oh, good. How are you?
Yeah, good. Good.
Nice.
It's interesting times.
So interesting time.
It seems
Wait,
like it's always interesting times. It'd be nice for it to be a bit more chill.
let's think together because at the bottom of the screen I've got like the major headlines, which are not 2026 expectations or tariffs anymore. So what should it be? Iran US war, I guess. Even though they said they would take it
Yeah.
away. What else?
Bear
What?
market?
Uh,
Question mark.
crypto coming back to life.
Yeah, rebound.
Bottoms in? Question mark.
ETF flow. What else?
STRC.
Stable coins and crypto equities, maybe.
Yeah, that'll be. I mean,
I mean,
Fed meeting today as well.
so seriously, I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about Circle, so you
Okay,
can
sure.
brag.
Nice pat on the back there.
Yeah, I should probably sell now. As soon as people start congratulating you on a trade, it's like time to sell.
But from a chart perspective, it looks still relatively early. I just think you got at a great time. And so you see this kind of bottom forming and then like this massive pump, and it doesn't sound like or doesn't feel like it should retrace. So
Possibly, yeah. Always hard to say.
yeah.
But I thought the entry seemed like a fairly good spot. So
Which price did you get in at?
around 60.
Where is it
Nice.
trading now?
134.
134. Damn.
Pre-market. Yeah. So there you go. Easy
I love
money.
your line in the group chat. Cancel inverse Satiris.
Let's see. I don't want to count chickens.
Before the hatch.
Still
Thomas,
need to sell the fucking thing.
maybe we can start with you with regards to like I don't know general market expectations, what you think about the whole geopolitical conflict, because I still feel like it's driving most of the investor sentiment these days. But then you can see crypto somewhat outperforming, or at least it feels that way. So what do you think about all that?
Yeah, it's really really quite interesting. Obviously, we're at the moment in an environment that is purely driven through geopolitical events, right? And notably, I mean that's quite obvious, but I still think it's worth sort of chatting about it. It's the oil price that's affected. Now that is a very very difficult market. Now it's easy in terms of, well, obviously oil prices are going to go up, but it's difficult to say as to what that is going to mean for the oil markets that are going to be really really quite relevant, right? So and by relevant I mean everybody's already affected through it one way or another, right? So everybody that's driving would have noted that prices would have gone up, especially in the US. The question is now, when is that going to trickle down into discretionary decision making? Am I going to take that trip? Am I going to take that holiday? That sort of behavior, that's going to be quite an interesting one. And ultimately, we'll see if the futures are actually slightly in backwardation, as in they're now lower over the 2 months, which is the most, well, I suppose, notable point in time that people are looking at, which means that the expectation right now is that we're at the peak of the sort of crisis, but that's just a function of what's happening. So we're at the mercy of markets. If it doesn't resolve, there's multiple projections as to what that will do to the oil price. It can go all the way up to 150 in a quite severe scenario, which then, and now we're getting to the weeds of it, and crypto and risk assets, it's ultimately is going to affect the 10-year. And that's going to affect funding in the US, and specifically, it's going to affect the risk premium that any institute that there's been a lot of chatter on sort of shadow underwriters, right? So non-bank credit entities, well, non-bank, non-credit entities that provide credit, right? So there's a lot of like leasing and other sort of sources of short-term cash that can be provided, and how the 10 years are ultimately going to affect that risk premium. So that can venture into a geopolitical shock that will hit markets quite a bit. Now, it doesn't feel to me at the minute as though that risk is, famous last words, priced in already. So I don't feel like we have just yet an idea as to how long this is going to go on. The question as well is that something that the US could easily roll back from? Which I think this is at this time a one-way door. I don't think that there is any sort of way to take back the drones, take back the rockets. That's done. So I think from that perspective, it is everybody's at the mercy of the response, and it looks like initially the idea was, well, the regime has been toppled, but that doesn't quite look like it at the minute, right? So, and it's just a function of how that's sort of moving. Yes, crypto has been outperforming as well, which I am not sure as to whether or not that's going to be sustainable, or whether that's just going to be a rally that at some point is going to hit some kind of top, like a local top, and from there it will go notably lower. I mean, Bitcoin isn't a risk-off asset. We've I think experienced more than once. So from that perspective, it's quite odd to see it actually outperform. You can argue that it did sort of underperform before. It could be related to people moving into Bitcoin because it's very easily sort of to move around as opposed to gold, right? If you're thinking of it as some sort of emergency asset, because all you need is a seed phrase, and that you can carry with you in your brain if you can. And so from that perspective, that could be one of the reasons. ETH has been on a bit of a, well, dare I say, tear as well, which is interesting. And then so those are my thoughts. It's not, I don't have an answer. I can just sort of observe at the minute, but it's too early to call it one way or another. And I would be curious to see as to what were to happen if the conflict were resolved tomorrow, as to what that would do to crypto, because ultimately I think that might be an opportunity for people to rotate back into these other risk assets, which are not necessarily Bitcoin, Ethereum, and sort of crypto equities that don't have their own driving forces. Like I'm sure we'll talk about Circle at some point, but I'll leave that up to the experts in the room. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. Sorry, a bit long-winded, but with no clear answer. But yeah, I think it's an interesting one.
No, but that's great. I'll just jump in because I have like something very short to say. But then, Sotiris, I'd love to also hear your expectations about the whole conflict and the impact on markets. But I think something you kind of alluded to, Thomas, is like, it is very dependent on other events. When you're looking at crypto markets, and for me, the pump we've had, it still feels relatively shallow, and I would almost put it in the same sort of trend or dynamic than the move down, basically, which is, there hasn't been a clear catalysis besides the fact that sure, leverage positions get liquidated on the way down, and then we pump back up because some of the leverage short, they get liquidated on the way up. And so you're still in this kind of weird range between 65 and 75K. And I'm like, is there something that makes me very confident about us going much higher? Not really, because the world hasn't really changed much. But then when we were down, did I feel like we needed to go down further? not as well, right? Neither, because I
Mm.
don't think anything has changed dramatically or that there's a strong narrative for it going down, besides the fact that investor sentiment is kind of pessimistic across the board. And of course, crypto is a bit more volatile. So I just wanted to throw it in there, which is I do feel like it's still macro driven, but I also feel like the moves we're seeing right now in crypto markets, whether they're up or down, they feel kind of shallow and without any substance or real belief one way or the other, which is maybe not a bad place to be, and maybe an opportunity to accumulate or settle into a range before going one direction or the other. That's it. But Sotiris, I think you're way more plugged into all the first the social media and the news, and also kind of like more reactive trading in markets. What do you feel about the whole conflict? How do you think it's going to maybe get resolved in the near term or not? And how do you think it's affecting markets?
I'm probably taking an overly simplistic view at this, but I feel the amount of FUD in the markets because of this has been somewhat blown out of proportion. To begin with, the disruption is looking at about 20% of the global oil supply. And that's also not accounting for countries with oil reserves already. And so I think for not just the price of oil to like spike up so aggressively, but I think the sort of second and third order effects on increased oil prices, I struggle to see that affecting like the price of Google, for example. And it feels like there's been quite a lot of somewhat irrational risking off across the board. I'm guessing people are having flashbacks to the sort of forever war in the Middle East, the 20-year war in Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that. But again, I could be super naive in this, but I just don't think Trump or this current admin really wants to set up for that kind of like long-term engagement in the Middle East. And so I do think at the very least, this should be a relatively quick sort of engagement, conflict, war, whatever you want to call it. It could get messy, obviously, and I think trying to go in and do sort of long-term regime change with boots on the ground has just proven before there's not really a viable solution. And so at the very least, I think Trump could already declare some semblance of a victory that he's massively disrupted their sort of nuclear arms program and generally a sort of a thorn in their side when it comes to the armament across the board. So yeah, famous last words, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw sort of peak FUD behind us around this and there's some sort of face-saving exit from the US relatively soon. I think as well the fact that NATO have resoundingly not shown any continued support on this, I think is also quite telling, where at the very least that should be a signal to Trump that no one else really wants to get involved with this. And then I think as well, you're maybe seeing that in the markets where, given how much doom and gloom there has been, I feel overall markets have been holding up like relatively well. From a charting perspective, like the S&P and things and the NASDAQ do look like they're sort of rounding over and about to puke, but I feel quite a lot of steam was already let out of the system, especially around all the tariff FUD. And to see another massive correction within the same year, pretty much, I don't know, it just doesn't seem likely to me. So I've personally remained sort of long. Might not be the best move long term, I don't know, but right now I hope the conflict gets resolved fairly soon. I'm sure any sort of positive developments on anything getting resolved there, I think you're going to see a bit of a relief bounce across the board. There are other things like Thomas touched on about the 10-year and how that's going to affect risk assets. And so I think people are potentially pricing in sort of higher oil prices, which are going to push up CPI across the board, which means the Fed are less likely to cut rates. But again, I think that's sort of projecting out this like longer term impact. And especially for the US as well, I think it's important to remember that they already have fairly significant oil reserves and they've just opened up Venezuela for oil. And so I think it's probably more so China and India who are going to be at the mercy of these markets. And again, for Trump, that's good leverage sort of going into this summit with Xi about the sort of overall trade negotiations. But a lot of smart people are pretty worried. So I'm just a idiot degen. So who's
But
to know?
I think there's also two ways of handling this situation, and neither one is right or wrong. But one is about taking a perspective, whether you're bullish or bearish on markets at this point in time. And then I think there's also a lot of sophisticated players that would rather stay in cash just because of the uncertainty. Like the uncertainty itself is enough for them to not wanting to be allocated. So it's like I totally hear you, and actually I agree with you, but I also think that for the people that are more bearish, the potential for things to go wrong is still very high. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, do we expect another correction? Probably not. Is the US probably not going to be in Iran long term? Yeah, it's probably not going to happen. Do you know for certain, and would you rather stay in cash and so keep the US dollar or maybe gold versus other risk assets? Probably, because you never know what an extremist in Iran might do, or what neighboring countries might try to pull out, um, because of whatever happened, or how the Israel-US relationships are going to drive that. So I don't know. I just feel like there's so much uncertainty right now. I do think it's because you talked about it. Is I do think actually it's a very good move from the U.S. perspective with regards to negotiation with China and India, just because he's kind of secured Venezuela and Iran, and I guess that was a motivation all along, right? But yeah, I don't know. What do you
I
guys think?
think though,
Yeah.
I think just to add on Venezuela, so it has been opened up, and they beat, I think, the US in baseball last night as well, which that was an interesting one. But I think to get production to a level that is significant, that is going to be a multi-year, if not like a decade-long process,
Hmm.
because obviously, so they had very, very sophisticated operations about, I think, 20 years ago, could have been 25. So that's sort of the level of sophistication that they're dealing with. And imagine something not being maintained because you don't have the parts, you don't have the right materials, you don't have all of the things that it takes to sort of maintain these the infrastructure. So, and there's still a high degree of uncertainty because obviously now, well, what was done was done. But now, is that necessarily a business case for a multi-year for multinational oil companies to say, right, let me just put $50 billion of investments worth in that country when previously it had been seized by the government. And I think that sort of that's still, and that, I mean, even if that probability were 10%, and you're going to be losing $5 billion, that is not necessarily a move that would be reasonable for management to do. And I think 10% is probably a very aggressive estimate, right? So, and with all of these political regime changes, it just never quite or rarely comes and falls the way that it is assumed, right? Because it's such a complex system. And I think quite similarly, we could think of Iran as like a really complex system that has sort of internal drivers, but also has a lot of external dependencies that sustain that regime. I mean, oil in Iran is extremely cheap. And I think the oil in Iran, that's an interesting one as well, is also in terms of its composition actually the best oil out there because it doesn't require too much of refinery work. It's not too light. so that you need like too much of it and it's not too heavy. So it has the perfect composition for refineries to be running extremely efficient. That's sort of the other thing as well. And obviously, China is one of the biggest customers of Iran. And I mean, they probably still have some pipelines sort of running, but that's ultimately what's going to drive this massively, right? What's China going to do about this, and and how do they think about it? I think actually one of the winners right now is Russia, because they get to supply their oil, which ultimately puts the US in a position of weakness. So that was a surprise winner as well. I mean, it's all 4D chess at the end of the day. And I think that was an interesting one, I thought. And then that ultimately can also change the geopolitical situation in Europe. So it could have been one of those like events that made a lot of changes. And I think that it is not smart for the US to move out of that just yet, because they cannot be seen in a spot of weakness. Similarly to, I believe, when Tsar Alexander got into power in Russia in the early 20th century, one of the first things he did, he's right, I'm going to go to war with Japan. And they had quite a big, like their marine operations, one of the biggest in the world at the time. And it had turned out that technologically it just wasn't there. So they'd lost their perceived strength. And that's one thing that's really, really quite important in terms of really all of the dynamics that's happening, and as to what extent the US can influence decisions as they have very, very strongly over the last year.
But so, go ahead, Sotiris.
Oh no, I was going to say, sort of further to that point as well, Iran saying they'll open up the Strait of Hormuz as long as you settle oil in RMB, in Chinese yuan. And so that was, again, like super unlikely situation, but it's just sort of another planting of a seed in the global public's mind of the sort of downfall of USD as the global reserve currency, looking for alternatives. I think the recent gold rally has also fueled that narrative where mostly China, but other countries have been dumping their sort of US treasuries as they're sort of losing a bit of faith in the US's ability not to default, as you see sort of these rising debt to GDP ratios and things like that. And so it is sort of an interesting time where the US's sort of global superpower dominance is even being questioned. I do think it's generally overblown, because even if the US is starting to sort of lose some of its dominance globally, what's there to replace it with? And right now, I don't think China's in a position to sort of become the global superpower or the sort of global reserve currency. And so even if US is weakening, there's no alternative really at the moment. So again, I think it's a lot of fear overblown, but it is kind of worth noting, I think, just the sort of shifting in sentiment around this. And one other thing I was going to say with the oil trade, I saw something about the traders in London using the Iranian central bank as this sort of like off the grid source of liquidity that's out of the purview of the US, and they've been using that to sort of prop up the gold bid, and seeing oil spike and gold start to come down, I think is maybe sort of telling of some fractures happening there as well.
I just want to push back on one part, which is, I understand what you're saying about the US kind of losing dominance on the global scene, because there's a lot of things that are happening. And so a lot of cracks and opportunities for the non-dominating power to kind of come in and try to grab some kind of hegemony over a certain industry, sector, region, whatever. But I would also make the opposite point, which is, I think after the military operation in Venezuela and what they've been able to achieve in Iran, whether that ends in a good way or in a bad way, I feel like most of the world leaders must be looking at this with like, don't piss off the big guys type of thing, because again, I think from a purely military perspective, what they've been able to pull off in Venezuela with this kind of kidnapping of the leader and then killing so many of the leaders in Iran over the span of essentially 48 hours and the amount of destruction they've been able to inflict. I'm like, if I was China right now, I wouldn't push too much. If I was Russia, I wouldn't push too much. And same thing with all the guys around the US. There's talks about Cuba or before Greenland and so on. I'm like, I think Trump is coming across, and he wants to, as like a guy who will do whatever the hell he wants. And when he does do it, there's not a lot of things you can do to fight him, right? So yeah. But again, I don't know if that's going to ultimately
Very much
result in a
agree.
net positive for the US, but I'm just saying, as a military operation, they're pretty good still, right?
No, incredibly so. The only thing that could be viewed as a slight weakening globally, though, is the power of sort of allies and allegiances.
Yeah.
And so the weakening of sort of the NATO coalition or the US's involvement in that, and the sort of like pulling back of support from allied countries, whilst the US is still the massively dominant sort of military industrial complex that it is, and no other military can kind of even get close to rivaling it, I do think a large part of its strength also does rely on its allies. And if they start to pull back there, I think you start to see some weakening, but at the same time, no other country is going to be able to challenge the US directly. Maybe China in like 20 years, but
or sooner. But on that very point, and it might be a bit of a controversial take, but I find it shameful that the allies aren't stepping up to support the US operation. And I know that in the current zeitgeist, it's kind of like US and Israel are the bad people, and the Europeans and Canada are doing the right things by not, and so on. But I feel like, especially in the Iran situation, there was such a clear humanitarian wrong that was going on, with the local populations kind of rising up and protesting, not across just the capital, but across multiple cities, and the regime essentially killing indiscriminately a lot of people. Now, of course, I'm under no delusion that the US or Israel stepped in, to save those people. They have like their own incentives and so on. But I'm like, when you're allies of the US, and when the US has been funding military defense for the past few decades, and they're stepping in and asking for support, I think that was the time where Europe should have supported and stepped in the same way that in the Second World War, the US could have been like, you know what, not our conflict, not our war, so we're not going to do much. And then they still ended up stepping in and be actual allies. And I'm like, you can talk about the whole rhetoric and whether you approve on the immigration, on the taxations, on the tariffs, on the deteriorating relationship, and so on. But I feel like there was an opportunity for European countries to kind of step up and actually go on the offensive alongside the US. And they didn't do that, I guess, for ideological reasons and not for smart diplomatic reasons. But that's, again, just my personal take.
I think
there is a slippery slope where it's like, oh, this country has people protesting, let's go invade and liberate them. And I think time again, regime change hasn't really panned out that well for people or the US.
And totally, and maybe it won't, right? Maybe it won't pan out well, but I'm just saying, in the case of Iran, there was like it's just not like protesting, it's like serious, massive, across the board, women, men, young, old people protesting an oppressive regime for like multiple decades as well. And they were killing like just an insane number of people, like. And so there's a slight hypocrisy, I think, with some people that are looking at previous conflicts and be like, oh, there's 10,000 people that were killed by these and these people. And then you've got multiple dozens of thousands of people, so like tens of thousands of people being killed by their own regime. And then when someone steps in, it's like, oh, but it's US imperialism, therefore it's bad. And I'm like, it might not be done by the right people for the right reasons. But when you've got tens of thousands of people being killed by their own government, I don't know. I don't feel like it's a gray area. For me, it's pretty black and white on that front.
Pushing back slightly on that, though, I would have imagined to see more of a response from the people of Iran who were protesting, because it seems like the general consensus in Iran is still that being like anti-US, and they don't want the US's involvement. And so, and again, it's a country of like 100 million people, and so you could have a couple of 100,000 people out protesting, and they could still be the like main minority of people. And it is a very conservative country. They toppled the previous monarch because they wanted sort of more traditional Islamic laws and rules, and so I think culturally that can also run deep. Do I personally think Iran was way better in the 60s, where it was a lot more liberal and women actually had freedom and didn't need to wear burqas and things like that? For sure. But it can be quite different than what the people themselves necessarily want. Even though there was a lot of protesting and protesters getting shot as well. So,
but I think that comes down to which echo chamber one is. I put myself, as in there as well, as in whether you're probably pro US or anti US, and then you kind of see the content that validates, the fact that the population wasn't for the US. I see a lot of content saying that they were, for the US intervention. And so it's like, which one is right? It's really hard. But just to put it back in perspective, so the royal family that was put out or taken out in the 60s, I believe, or early 70s, it essentially were anti-religion. But I don't think it was about the lifestyle, of like more education, more openness, more freedom. But it's the fact that within that trend, he was also very kind of like anti-Islam, or not really letting people practice religion the way they wanted. And so there was a return to more traditional values. But I think if you're looking at that point to justify the point that we're at now in the 2020s, I mean, so much has happened, both from the regime side and from how the world has evolved and the perception of the local population, that it's really hard to say that means that they were for the current actions of the regime right now. And I think if you ask most people in Iran, would you rather live in the US or rather live in Iran? You would have more people that would go for the lifestyle that you get in the US versus the one that you have in Iran. Not to say that it would be 100%, agreement, but I think the majority of the people would want that, right? And the reason why you can see it is you've got a lot of people running out of Iran and towards more developed countries, but you have nobody from more developed countries going to Iran. So there's something at just a basic fundamental level that tells you there are more people who are in distress and willing to abandon their lives to get out of an oppressive regime, rather than people trying to come in to live their religion more fully, right? And if you were fully into Islam and Muslim, as a Muslim, there's a lot of countries outside of Iran that you can go to, and kind of practice it if you felt like it didn't work well. And I think you've got plenty of people that were celebrating the US bombing of their own country, which I think is so effed up in a way, and kind of tells you that people were desperate for some change in the current setup, right? The status quo. So that's it. But again, maybe I'm just in my own echo chamber. So.
One thing on the Muslim thing, though, is Iran's Shia majority, which is one of the few countries, and like all of the neighborings are Sunni majority. And so, not all Islam is created equally. So I do think it's harder for Iran to play nice with its neighbors. But
I think, but then it kind of justifies an oppressive regime, because it's a bit like if you take the USSR and not everybody was against communism. No, indeed. And some people love, Lenin and so on. Yeah, agreed. But when you've got the Berlin Wall falling, you've got most people from the communist side that go to the capitalist side, and nobody from the capitalist side going to the communist side, right? So, of course, you can always pick and choose. Yeah, there are people that are really sad and nostalgic about the communist era. But broadly speaking, people are more for the openness to Western values rather than against, right? And I think it comes down to that, right? You're never going to have like a full majority in some kind of democratic or broad population survey, but you can kind of infer just by people's behavior, right? So, yeah, that's it.
I'm pro-liberal democracies.
No, and I know you are. Right?
No authoritarian.
But I think sometimes we kind of and I think we make the mistake of being so balanced, in our perspective, that we're like, oh, but it's a very complex issue, and so it's not necessarily, and so on and so on. I'm like, I still think there are some things, some setups where it's like there's a clear wrong and right, Not to say that everybody will agree with it or everybody will benefit, or not even saying that long term it will have positive consequences, because I think Thomas mentioned it earlier. It's like regime changes typically don't have the super positive effect that they're being pitched as. So I'm totally not rosy eyed, with regards to the situation. But I feel like, yeah, broadly speaking, we can infer that the majority of Iranians, especially let's say women or LGBTQ, people and so on, or anybody that has more of an openness to Western values, is rejoicing from a potential regime change versus wanting to stay with the previous one or the current one. So that's it.
I mean, Exhibit A is actually Iran, because what happened in the 70s was partly at the hand of the US, right? So arguably they are where they are because of a regime change that somebody thought was a good idea back in the day, and here we go. So I think, I mean, yeah, a very, very complex issue. I think there's also no right or wrong. It's just ultimately for us is what does it mean for markets, and where is sort of the next opportunity unfolding on this. I think on the EU, just to sort of like close that, I do believe that the ask was specifically to protect ships in Hormuz, which is probably a bit of a suicide mission, simply because they, as in Iran, actually had been really, really effective with very cheap drones. And I think that's so destructive sort of drones, and they have and the US actually copied, which has been rather rare, that technology, because they realized how cheap it was. And if Iran can sort of do it, then it must be relatively effective. So that, just to be fair, and it's just nowhere near a temperature where one would or could remain popular in their country whilst sort of signing off on something like that, when it is very likely that you're sending a few soldiers to death. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there's air support and all of these things, but you're sending also people to death on these ships. That ultimately, once something happens there, the insurance premiums are going to go through the roof, if you can even insure it in the first place, at which point it might actually turn into a much, much more adverse sort of scenario, right? It's sort of devil might actually be worse than what you're fearing at times. And I think it could be one of those. But I think with the current sort of market structure, where's our head at, and what would we want to see in order for us to sort of be, and I think probably I'm still not quite sure on equities, on crypto, because we did discuss that. It feels like low volume. It feels like, I mean, can I use the B word? It feels like we are in a bear market at the minute, which means what ultimately there are going to be a lot more months ahead of us for this sort of market structure to bottom out. Maybe we've already hit the bottom, but perhaps we'll see a lot of sideways action. How do we feel about that? And I think notably, Sathish, I still haven't heard anything about Circle. Somebody, I think, called it at 50 or 60 and thought, well, actually, that might be a good idea. I think that would be generally, and I think crypto equities and generally what's happening behind closed door, not so much closed doors really, but the infrastructure on the crypto side is actually moving pretty fast. A lot of questions, but I'd love maybe, Sathish, your thoughts on Circle. Let's go with your victory lap first.
Mostly a broken clocks, right? Twice a day. So I feel my Circle trade is probably more that than anything else. But I had just a very simple thesis that I think stablecoin usage is only going to propagate more and more, and especially with the advent of a lot of these AI agents, I think the most natural means of sort of commerce is going to be stablecoins. And so, like, long term, I was pretty bullish on sort of the increased adoption of stables, and Circle's like pretty much the only stock you can buy currently that'll give you exposure to that. I think Circle and Tether are pretty much the only main players in the game as well. And so you've got like a relatively sort of like narrow choice of options there. And Tether's not even public yet. And also Tether was sort of initially talking about an IPO at sort of 500 billion. And I think Circle was sitting around 50 billion at the time. And then again, it's just that sort of like disconnect. And so I wasn't expecting a sort of massive rally off good earnings. As it turned out, it was more of a, I'm happy to buy around these levels and hold it for the next 3-4 years as we see increased adoption. I think it also was interesting seeing their sort of presence at Davos. And I listened to an interview with Jeremy, and he was saying about how in a bear market as well, they actually sort of see increased uptick as people like risk off into stables. And then as rates are coming down, it's actually better for business as well because you increase the velocity of money. And so I was just kind of like, again, looking at these sort of bigger picture things that I think just seem to coalesce into like, oh, this seems kind of like it's been oversold. So I managed to load up in like a relatively good amount of size. Given the recent price action, how much it spiked up, I'm not sure if I'm gonna sell at least a portion of it just to risk off, and maybe reallocate if it dips at some point. But at least for now, it's played out quite nicely. As far as like other crypto stuff goes, I think Bitcoin's probably the most interesting one to look at right now, just because it does tend to dictate a lot of the overall market sort of sentiment. It's kind of funny how a week or two of positive price action can just like flip everyone from like bearish to bullish again. And so if you're on crypto Twitter still, everyone's pretty euphoric at the moment, and so that's generally a bit of a worrying sign. What I would say though is, and again, this is the most famous last words, like this time is different. With that said though, I feel with the institutional adoption of Bitcoin and just the global sort of spread of it, I do think that is going to dampen volatility, both to the upside and downside. And so if you look at the sort of where we topped out at compared to the previous all-time high, it was only like a 60-70% increase. And so it's not your like 10-20x's of a couple of cycles ago. It was like a little bit more muted. And so I do think any kind of pullback might also be less than people are expecting. And just from a sort of vibe standpoint, everyone I've heard is like, yeah, around 50K, that seems like to be a good spot to buy. Like talking with almost complete certainty it'll get there. And so I wouldn't be surprised if either the bottom's in now and it's just like front run everyone, or 50K is not the place to buy, and then we end up going down to like low 30s and like everyone shits the bed. So I think it's maybe one of those kind of scenarios. And just one final point on that, Don Alt, one of the guys on crypto Twitter, he nailed pretty much the bottom and top of Bitcoin for the last 2 or 3 cycles, and he's been buying at these levels, which I think is potentially quite telling as well. And he risked off, he pretty much sold all his position around 110. So he seems like he's got fairly good intuition. So
and what is he saying about the current market?
He said he's not sure if it's bottom, but he's happy to buy here,
right.
And add it to sort of a hodl bag. And so, yeah, I think there's like some interesting factors as well. So with the micro strategies or strategies stretch product,
Yeah.
that again's just been sort of twapping $1 billion plus. You have these sort of like infinite bid mechanisms now as well that I think might also help sort of front run a bottom a little
Mm.
bit if
Mm.
you've got this sort of relatively price insensitive maniac who's just trying to buy all the fucking Bitcoin under the sun. But then again, a whale from 2011 might wake up and just rain on everyone's parade and just continue to market dump stuff. So it's really hard to say. But right now, I think we're sitting at a lot of support. Maybe I can share my screen quickly for a bit of astrology.
While you do that, I just want to echo what you're saying, which is I do think the volatility for like longer term markets is definitely kind of lower because of the institutional involvement. So yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and so I think what we're kind of seeing here is where's shapes like quite a lot of support around this sort of area. So it's the kind of previous double top here, a lot of consolidation before a push, a retest. And so I think at least for a bounce, this seemed like quite a natural sort of area. And I think it's going to be quite a lot of resistance to break through. I do worry though, if we break through such a heavy resistance, it might get nastier and end up around this sort of lower pocket that again is a sort of interesting range where you've got some sort of like previous retest resistance and consolidation. And so these are the kind of levels I'm personally looking at. But again, I've not had the best track record when it comes to trading crypto the last 6 months. But
also, Soteris, if I may stay on the chart, right? But I think you inadvertently also drew a curve at a slightly higher, like an intermediate floor. So you see, if we go down basically along your pink line, the first bottom that you drew, I think that itself is also a potential bottom, right? But of course, we're now debating astrology, as in. But I definitely think that's also an area where prices have converged, and so maybe that's the ultimate trick of like people saying, "Oh, we have to go down to 50," just like you said with so much certainty. Oh, we're 100% going there, right? And then they get counter traded. The shorts, the leverage shorts, get liquidated, and we're like, oh, okay, we're back on a full. The bottom was like the mid 60Ks, and then there's yet another game that actually gives them what they were saying in the very first place, which is that lower 50K, maybe upper 40K, level, and then an actual consolidation where everybody's looking at the chart the same way you are, which is, oh, then it has to go down to like 30 or 25K, and that just never happens, and then we go on for a full ramp up because midterm elections, because rate cuts, because end of geopolitical conflict, because negotiations on tariff, blah, blah, blah. And I just think sometimes the most ironic thing that can happen is like everybody being right, but at the wrong time, basically.
No, exactly. And one other thing as well, from an indicator standpoint, RSI, you've obviously got to take with a pinch of salt, but looking at the kind of previous bottoms, these two vertical red lines, the RSI was pretty low on the weekly. So here in December, it sort of was around 29. Here it bottomed out around 27, and then you actually got the true low with the RSI slightly higher. And so from an RSI standpoint, we're already back down around the range of the last two lows. And so even if the bottom's not in now, I feel is probably going to be in soon-ish.
Yeah.
And again, looking at the MACD as well, like this is pretty extreme compared to sort of previous cycles as well. And so, I don't know. It like the whole price action of Bitcoin of pretty much all of last cycle was one of like muted expectations and it being a bit of like a depressing cycle. Like I personally didn't feel like euphoric at any real point of the cycle. Maybe around like some points during the meme coin phase, but like generally I didn't get a sense of this like crazy market euphoria. The thing that was the trigger to me where I started, even on this show, started feeling a bit more bearish, was when all the DATs started launching in quick succession, because that just felt like very manic, but crypto bros weren't really reaping the benefits of it. It was just Tommy Lee who can raise like $5 billion to buy ETH at the top. And so I do feel behavior like that, though, was some red flags. And then if you look at the top in October, we've already had like 6 months nearly of pretty much down only, which compared to previous bear cycles as well, like it's normally only been a year pretty much from top to bottom. And so
I think
we might not be that far away.
The conclusion, which you've kind of already said, is essentially what Don Alt, might be saying as well, which is it's a time to be accumulating, and you don't know if it's the actual bottom. There's definitely uncertainty about future price action, but it's like probably the 65K level wasn't a bad time to be buying, and actually probably the 70K wasn't a bad time to be buying either. And if we do go down to 60K or 55K, it will be a great place to be a buyer of Bitcoin. And then you kind of, it's not really true averaging in, but it is an averaging on a retracement or a bear market. And then you wait for the next leg up that comes whenever it needs to come. So yeah, maybe that's that.
One final thing, if we all still believe Bitcoin's going to like 1 million, then anything we're kind of buying at these levels is still going to be a pretty good ROI.
Please get Bitcoin to 1 million. I just I want to be done with this. Thomas, I feel like Sotiris and I have been chattering for the past 20 minutes. What do you think about all this?
No, I think it was pretty good. It's nice to sort of zoom out and look at it, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I didn't quite think that we were, and quite evidently so, because we've been still sort of very bullish in the last couple of calls, but at this point, I think it's time to sort of change our minds in that this is actually a bear market. And I'll go with, and I think it definitely makes sense. I think probably a year, which would put us about towards about October, November, right? And well, October, definitely October. So that's like 6 months out now, 7. So I think probably the most rational approach at this is to accumulate like every week, probably whenever there's any sort of volatility spikes, you want to double down on that accumulation, and that's sort of the best way forward. So yeah, I fully agree. Now's the time to DCA. What I'd love to hear as well is your thoughts on Ethereum, because that we've obviously seen a bit of an outsized bounce there. There is a lot of cypherpunk versus the rest of the world chatter at the moment, especially when it comes to privacy, which we did touch on a little bit, which is a necessary evil. I mean, evil in a sense, so not all privacy is necessarily correlated with money laundering. It is a matter of obfuscation that is at times required in order to keep certain things private. And even from a PDPA perspective, that's really, really quite important. Not everybody would want to have their like salary shared, and it's quite easy if you're getting monies from if you're getting your salary monies from a wallet, then obviously at that point you can just kind of see what on payroll day what's being paid out, and you can very easily see how you're flying like within your peers. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And the question is that something that can be solved, or do we need to resort back to the current very highly obfuscated banking structure where everything is sort of just in databases in which case we don't need blockchains to begin with, because it's just a super expensive technology that you're running for no necessary utility, right? So, and the answer is probably somewhere in between. But I think that's still probably something that we will be seeing privacy, and that's also going to be pushing out the likes of Circle a little bit more, because again, anybody that's transacted with fiat and crypto and that has done size is very quickly going to realize how much a pain in the butt fiat actually is, and how easy it is and predictable, more importantly, to get crypto from A to B. And so I think from that perspective, yeah, it's interesting. Would love to hear your thoughts on Ethereum. Where we're standing, I mean, it's obviously somewhat of a stable coin. If we look back all the way through to like 2021, right, we've got like a nice range there. But what are our thoughts on? Yeah.
I'm actually pretty bullish ETH again. I think on our last call, I kind of flipped bullish on it for the first time in what's felt like 2 years. I think with the updated roadmap as well, that's sort of trying to eat a bit of L2's lunch, where they're actually looking at sort of scaling again. I think it does become the sort of like everything computer that it once promised to be. And again, I think with the whole like AI agentic sort of wave that's coming, I'm really surprised more people aren't talking about that, actually, because that feels like such an obvious use case for crypto to me. And I'm like, agents are just going to be such an insanely large TAM that they're going to be everywhere doing everything. And crypto is the obvious means of like, not just sort of like transfer of value, but also like validation of digital information. And so it's like, finally, it feels like crypto has actually got a use case that's not just hot air. Obviously, these things take time to play out, but I think the market will wake up to that, and Ethereum is quite uniquely sort of positioned in with that. And then also, I feel ETH is still the sort of number 2 to Bitcoin, and so you saw all the attention last cycle on sort of institutional Bitcoin adoption. You didn't really see the same amount of focus on Ethereum. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the next coming cycle, you start to see a lot more institutional adoption of Ethereum as well as a sort of catch-up trade to what happened with Bitcoin. And one final thing that I thought was interesting last cycle, Ethereum actually bottomed really quickly. And it bottomed about 6 months prior to when the Bitcoin bottom came in. And so even if we are to see a sort of like October bottom with Bitcoin, as would be sort of in line with the previous 4-year cycles, ETH bottoming out around this mark, again, isn't that far off sort of historically what it did last cycle. And so maybe stars are aligning for ETH. I'm pretty happy having a nibble around these levels personally to sort of add to a longer term bag again. Justin,
what do you think?
I mean, I think it's kind of interesting and probably very telling, because we're all in agreement. I mean, I almost wanted to make a parallel that I can't really quite fit in of, your view on Circle and the positivity or the bullishness on stable coins, and then what Ethereum represents as like an on-chain solution of that, as in enabling stable coins and on-chain transactions for all sorts of players, whether it's like trading entities or agents or just regular users. So I definitely think there's a bullish case to be made for it. I still have PTSD of the past 24 months and the fact that it's been the most stable coin, as a non-stable coin. And that's really horrible and painful, especially when you have Bitcoin performing so well, right? So I think there's probably recordings of us essentially pulling our hair out when Bitcoin is hitting 126 and Ethereum is still kind of hovering just above 2,500 or something like that, right? So it's just like, I struggle to bet again on a potential outperformance, because that's essentially what we're saying when we're buying any assets other than Bitcoin. It's like, oh, we think not only it's going to perform well, but it's going to outperform what I can get by just holding Bitcoin. So I struggle to do it. And while I'm saying this, I have bids that were filled on Ethereum not too long ago, right? So when Bitcoin was essentially in the 65K, I went on a little bit of a shopping spree on Bitcoin, on Ethereum, on Hyperliquid. Um, and something else that I'm actually even blanking on, embarrassingly enough, maybe Chainlink or something like that, right? And so the point is, so far it's playing out. I definitely think it was a good level to be acquiring those assets, Ethereum included. Do I believe it's going to go to the 10K that everybody's kind of hoping it will get to at some point? I really can't tell, but I definitely think it's not a bad place to be buying some, right? Yeah, Hyperliquid is good, right?
Love to hear the plug on Hyperliquid as well, Justin.
Well,
Welcome
it's just
back.
because I got wrecked so hard on lighter that I always held some Hyperliquid, and then I held some Aster, and then I switched. I essentially swapped all my Aster for lighter, and I think that was a terrible trade because I think Aster's performed much better, and I think I was just kind of like getting in too early. But let's see, maybe things will change.
I'm still pretty bullish lighter long term, but I think Hyperliquid though
Yeah,
is just
just performing better.
it's just an insane feedback loop where it goes to the revenue buying, and then now especially during times of chaos, it just thrives in all situations, and so I think it's very sort of uniquely positioned in that way. And looking at other assets, I think I've heard, at least through the grapevine, some bigger institutions have been buying hype pretty aggressively. I think you recently just saw a Galaxy Digital Cluster having bought about 140 million USD worth of hype. And so not like insignificant amounts being pushed into Hyperliquid right now.
I think also as a quick note, for market color is on the lighter front, something that didn't go well is basically the team was silent. So very few people could reach the team, and I just know that because I know some people that are close to the team, not that I've ever talked to the main guys, and they were saying, oh, the kind of the main team is offline, they're not answering messages. And I'm like, that's worrying as hell. And then at the same time, they got listed on a lot of exchanges, and the price action was essentially tepid, like nothing happened, right? Even though they were listing on all those exchanges. And I'm like, when you've got a token that's listing on all the big exchanges and there's no pump, when the main team isn't answering for no apparent reason, I'm just like, what needs to happen for things to change, right? And the funny thing is, I'm hoping things change because I'm still holding that main position, right, of lighter. I have no idea. I hope it does. I hope they're maybe staying silent to increase the impact of whatever they've got brewing. But right now, I'm just not seeing it. So that's it.
Please, the founder guys being a bit more quiet, because like
Yeah.
that was a bit of a red flag for me. Like the way he was tweeting, just like very sort of like
Yeah.
aggressively anti-competitors and stuff, and I just felt it was coming from a place of like defensiveness as opposed to just the confidence of the Hyperliquid team, who just kind of
Do their
I
thing.
guess know they're the shit, and they don't really have to feel the need to shit on people. They just kind of heads down and deliver. But everyone's different, so I'm liking Hyperliquid. I do still think it's going to be sort of an insanely good sort of token to hold long term. It's like one of the very few conviction holds I still have. Maybe around these levels, it's already getting a little bit frothy given the sort of 100% rally from the lows, but it feels potentially like buying Solana at around $20, $40 if we see another sort of crypto bull cycle in the next few years, which I think we probably will, because people love the crypto casino. And so I think as like a long-term hodl, I'd be pretty happy sort of stacking hype.
I think one of the things that I'd love to, but we're talking about crypto, and I do also need to like wrap it up. But one thing that we didn't quite discuss is, speaking of casino, is actually Robinhood, because I think as sort of this ultimately this player that's going to be, I mean, they just launched a super premium sort of credit card, so that it seems to me that they're building some kind of moat around everything that they're doing, and they have been extremely strategic in terms of adding utility to their platform. So I think at these levels as well, I would. I mean, this could is already a super app, but it could easily evolve into something a little stronger. And I think in terms of the team are doing insanely well.
Yes.
They've been super focused, super strategic in the things that they've added. So I think definitely also want to put on the watch list. And I think in terms of, I think, is 77 a bottom? Obviously, we still have a lot of geopolitical news sort of incoming, maybe. But if it isn't, then I think there's still a lot of support around anywhere between 65 through to through to the 60s. So I think that's probably one to watch as well. We can see it looks like there's very strong support, which could essentially be preceding like a massive drop at some point. But I think it's definitely a good value prop because it's already down 50%. And it's one of those that requires regulation. So you have your sort of, it's not your SaaS sort of business that may get interrupted by AI, but there's a lot of regulation around it. And that's ultimately the moat. And the way I'm starting to think about stocks a bit more is, I think that generally the replacement by AI SaaS discount is probably a little bit overdone at the minute. However, there's some merit to it, right, in the long run. So that's certainly something. So it's probably like not a bad idea to go software shopping as well. But this is one of those businesses that's highly regulated. So, and that's a big moat to me. And to a lot of other businesses. So I think from that perspective, that would be one as well that I just wanted to throw in there.
I fully agree. I bought a fat
Yes.
bag of it, about
Yeah, me too.
100, and then watched it drop another down to
Me
70,
too.
which has been painful. But I'm happy, even at buying 100, I was like pretty happy long term.
Yeah, I did the same. It's so funny, Satiris. Like I think we didn't even know about each other, but I was buying I even bought higher. So I bought 120, then 100, and then 80. Which now, looking at the chart, 80 looks like an okay place. So I could maybe add to lower my break-even point. But Thomas, it's so interesting that you talked about that, because I definitely, I'm echoing your bullishness about Robinhood, and also think the potential for them to diversify in a flurry of other business lines with an existing infrastructure, existing community, existing regulation, and so on, is so powerful. And it's very hard. You're talking about the moat. And I think that for a lot of trading platforms, the liquidity itself is the moat, right? So it's like, even if you put, I don't know, other platforms, other functionalities, AI, whatever you want to call it, the fact that you have a liquid order book across a lot of different markets, a lot of different products, a lot of different features that they might enable is super powerful. And so I'm not even a user of Robinhood myself, because in Hong Kong, correct me if I'm wrong, Sotiris, but I don't think it's available. But they're so good. And then also there's, if you want to type in TradingView, Sotiris, there's also RVI, which is the Robinhood Venture Fund. Yeah, the first one. So that's just launched literally, if you put it on a 4-hour or daily, it just launched basically. So it listed at $22, if I'm not mistaken, and now it's kind of been swinging around there. But I think it's really interesting as an intention. So Robinhood is essentially giving exposure to pre-IPO private market type of deals, which of course ties into what I do, so I can see a lot of the color, and so you can get exposure to, let's say, a Databricks before it gets listed, or a defense stock before it gets listed, and so on. Right now, they have a very small portfolio, so I don't find them super attractive or like something that I would want exposure to. But you can. I think if you go,
That's cool.
Anyway,
definitely something I'll I'll look into. And just one final thing with the Robinhood as well. I do think Hyperliquid is positioning themselves as the sort of on-chain Robinhood, where you've got not just crypto, you've got commodities, you've got prediction markets now coming on. And so I think you're starting to see that sort of like the house of all finance sort of playing out in both the more regulated space and then the Wild West of crypto.
Thomas,
guys.
I think you have to go and I have to go as well.
I also need to jump. But
great place to close it. Super nice chat. And of course, it was streaming on X and on YouTube. So we'll have a recording for posterity.
Awesome. All right.
Exactly. That's how we do.
Bye,
Have a
guys.
good one.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.